to Trump's America. I'm your host, Mick Larson. This week's podcast guest is Dr. Hector Garcia. He is a clinical and evolutionary psychologist. He spent his early career as a frontline PTSD treatment specialty provider, working primarily with combat veterans, and has worked treating patients with anxiety disorders and depression. His prior research has focused on masculine psychology and treatment utilization, the evolutionary psychology of warfare and reintegration, and occupational burnout among mental health providers. His research program is focused on evolutionary psychology. One of his current projects is investigating the evolutionary roots of occupational burnout. In particular, his lab is examining how our ancient social instincts misalign with the modern-day workplace to produce burnout. Dr. Garcia is also the author of 2 books in the field of evolutionary psychology. The first one, Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression. His second book, which we will discuss today, is titled Sex, Power, and Partisanship, How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. His work has been featured on C-SPAN, PBS, and he has an excellent TED Talk dealing with veterans and PTSD. His TED Talk promotes the idea that we train our soldiers for war. Let's train them to come home. Hector, welcome to the podcast. Was there something in particular that inspired you to write Sex, Power, and Partisanship?
Yeah, there most certainly was. So in the wake of the 2016 election and leading up to the 2016 election, just all of the political division that I saw all around me, not only in the news. I mean, you saw it. There were people, we were fighting in the streets, right? We were rioting. People were getting run over by cars and at protests, and all of that. But, it also made its way into families, into communities. Families split apart according to political differences. And I thought, wow, I really want to try to understand the psychology behind this, because our reactions seemed so volatile. They seem to come from such a primitive place. And I saw sides of people that I didn't see before. And I thought, well, there's something going on here. And I want to try to understand what's going on, because I want more political unity in our country. I think we're weakened when we're divided. So that was the main impetus. Yeah.
Before we get into it, from a 30,000-foot view, what do you think had changed between, let's say, when Obama first got elected in 2008 to, 2016? Was there anything that you thought going into it, like, that you could put your thumb on for what had changed?
Well, the political division we see today is not new. There were other times where our country has kind of been torn apart by differences in our politics. During the civil rights era of the 1960s is a good example, right? There were protests. There were people getting beat up or shot in the streets. I mean, it tore families apart. It tore communities apart. But I think Donald Trump was a big factor. And I also wanted to understand why Donald Trump. Now, as a social scientist, when I conduct empirical research, I have to be really careful to approach that research with, I have to be neutral, right? But I didn't, I've been very honest about this. I'm not a big fan, right? I think he was politically divisive. He still is. He knows how to push our evolutionary hot buttons. And so, I tried to be as objective as I could in describing why Donald Trump. But the truth is, when you look around and you listen to what world leaders across the globe have to say about Donald Trump, I mean, it's almost like he's objectively divisive. He has drawn more international criticism by world leaders than any other president we've ever had. So something is going on that most of the world sees, but half of our nation doesn't necessarily see. Um, that I think bared some kind of explanation, because I think that was a strong factor, and I think there was a certain reaction to having a black president for 2 terms that I think a segment of the population was not happy about, simply because I think Obama represented the outside tribe, which I'm sure we're going to get into. Yeah.
Yes, that's a great segue to, you mentioned hot buttons, political hot buttons. So let's go back to, the beginning of all this evolutionary wise and talk about in-group, out-group, what you just mentioned.
Yeah, and I think before I ever talk about anything having to do with evolutionary science, I always like to start with a few caveats. And one caveat, and it's an important one, and I hope everybody pays attention to this, is that we have to be careful not to commit the naturalistic fallacy. And that fallacy would sound something like this, just because it's evolutionary means that it's desirable or it's moral or it's inevitable, right? A lot of our traits are none of those things. And we have the power to make conscious choices that run counter to our impulses, but more so when we understand those impulses. And that is, I think, a formula that I think would better humanity all across the board. Um, Also, that I think, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, you tend to commit that fallacy in very circumscribed ways. I think people on the left, if they're committing that fallacy, it tends to sound like, well, gender inequality is bad. Discrimination on the basis of gender or sex is bad. Therefore, there can't be any sex differences, which I think that's a mistake. That's an error in thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You or war is horrible, so we can't possibly have a propensity for it, right? On the other end of the spectrum, we have a tendency for war, and we have a tendency to discriminate on the basis of sex. So those things are okay because it's natural. Those are all errors in thinking, and we have to think more rationally about our own impulses. And again, we have the ability to choose. There are sex differences, which I think we're going to talk about, right?
Right.
Especially in terms of our political leanings. So, political pundit Chris Matthews once said that Democrats are the mommy party and Republicans are the daddy party. So this is a trend that I think has been, noticed by people in popular culture who aren't, social scientists. There was also a meme floating about that Democrats are from Venus and Republicans are from Mars, right? And there is a leaning in that direction, right? So I think in order to understand those studies, we have to take a look at what those differences mean in terms of the natural curve, the bell curve from you may remember from high school biology.
Right.
Well, the sexes both have their own natural curve, and the frequencies look about the same, right? They're shaped like a bell, but the means tend to be different. And so what that means is that in general, there are a lot of traits on which men and women differ overall, but there's a lot of overlap, right? So when we start looking at sex differences, we can't think in categorical terms. We have to think probabilistically.
Mm-hmm.
And if we start talking about some of these sex differences, that doesn't mean it's inevitable, right? We're talking about a general tendency. But those slivers of difference say a lot about our politics, right? Um, Monica McDermott is a social scientist who looked at our gender differences and our political leanings. So she used the BEM sex role inventory that looked at gender being how culture shapes our political views and our cultural and our leanings towards one group of norms that are normally associated with sex, right? And what she found was that masculine men and more hypermasculine men and more masculine women tended to identify as Republican, and feminine women and more feminine men tended to identify as Democrat, which I think demonstrates that those overlapping natural curves
Mm-hmm.
nicely, I think. Does that make
And
sense?
yeah, oh yeah, 100%. And we actually have, and you can expand on this. We actually have evidence that uh, countries that are led by women tend to fund more policies that are beneficial to what women's needs are, whether it be childcare, more investment in education, K through 12, and all that kind of stuff. That certainly the Scandinavian countries, I think, have that going for them.
Yeah, we do see those kinds of differences. And again, politics can involve such rabid emotion, and that's why I think it's important to not look at the surface level, look at where these emotions come from. And so in order to understand politics, truly what drives that sort of emotional intensity, we have to look at our evolutionary psychology. Um, and I think in order to understand what you just mentioned, I think we have to understand, our mating preferences and how they tend to differ according to sex. And looking at David Buss's seminal research, across the globe, across every continent, across every political system, across socioeconomic status, men on average tend to prefer more mates than women. They tend to prefer variety. They tend to prefer, think of it as numbers, right? Because men can reproduce theoretically with every sexual encounter, and that's not a biological reality for women, right? Women, on the other hand, who are usually tasked with rearing offspring across the globe, tend to be a lot more conservative as far as that goes, and tend to prefer quality in their mates. They tend to prefer men who are more likely to provision them, so men with resources. And this is one of these things that we see across every society on the globe, right? So part of what I think infuses male politics, or politics for men, and conservative politics, I should say, are some of these evolutionary imperatives. One of the best ways to understand our political orientations, where they come from, and in that very question, is looking at some of the evolutionary pressures of our ancestral environments. One of them was the pressure of outside tribes. So when we look at extant hunter-gatherers, the few that remain, and when they've been studied in the early 1900s and across the past century, what we find is that warfare was pretty common. All right, so it wasn't uncommon for tribes to form raiding parties, attack the rival tribe, kill as many men as they could, and take the women as their spoils of war. So that threat was an evolutionary pressure that men faced, and a lot of that has to do with mate competition, right? So if you have a segment of the population for whom numbers means fitness, as we see for men, you're going to see a lot of competition. So that posed a challenge to overcome, that I think drove tribalism among men in particular, and drove our political orientations. And so when we look today at conservatives, on average, they tend to support more hawkish foreign policy, which reflects, I think, that pressure. Um, they tend to support more funding for defense. They tend to be, pretty staunch on border security, as we see, and that reflects that threat. We see that more among men, and we see that more among male-leaning, political ideologies.
They also, on the flip side of that, if there's two directions they can go, which you just explained, and then they also can be isolationists, um, to try to, uh, keep everybody out or keep them out from interacting with everybody else. It's kind of both of them are forms of protectionism, but they're just a different model.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this has to do with how we fall on this bell curve, this natural curve, So one study looks, so if you take just fear of outsiders, for example, or xenophobia, right? You can measure that, and all of our traits fall on the normal curve. So there are some of us who fear outsiders pretty strongly, right? And are suspicious of people who look different than us or speak different than us or have a different culture or religion or sexual orientation. And on the other extreme end, you have people who are very extremely open to people who aren't like us, and most of us fall somewhere in between. Well, that where one lies on that curve predicts where one lies politically pretty strongly across the globe. So the more conservative that you are, the more likely you are to fear outsiders. And a lot of this reflects an era in which we were constantly looking over our shoulder to see if the rival tribe was going to attack us when we were sleeping or out hunting or gathering, right? So I think people come about this fear honestly, they just enact it unconsciously, right? Um, so in our past, there were benefits to being wary of outsiders, and there were benefits to being open to outsiders, right? The most obvious of which are if you're not wary of outsiders, that's a good way to get slaughtered, right? If you don't pay attention to the tribes who are a threat to us, well, you're gonna get eliminated, especially if you're a man, right? And that's a
Right.
thing. Um, Whereas, if you're totally close to outside tribes, there are going to be genetic bottlenecks, right? You're not going to exchange mates. You're going to inbreed, and that poses certain problems. Your technology is not going to develop. Your
Yeah, just simple trade.
yeah, you're gonna not benefit from trade and things like that. So there in our past there were benefits to both of those extremes, right? Both of those tendencies. Um, the big question that I ask is how much does xenophobia serve us today? How much does it still serve us in the modern era? When we're trading internationally, we're sharing technology internationally. um does it benefit us to lower that? Are there certain circumstances where that uh it would hurt us to be more xenophilic? And we have to ask these kinds of questions and be honest about what we find.
And like you said, depending on where you are on that bell curve or spectrum, is going
Yeah.
to dictate how you are politically. Also, probably, that politics is going to come into policy as well. Um, you, you might give some examples of how that would work out, how someone leaning one way or the other, how those things become policy and how that looks.
Yeah, well, one way to understand political orientation, I think that will help frame the answer to that question. What is politics? I mean, that's something that I really try to answer. Like, what is it really? Why do we have these political differences? Why do we have political preferences? And one answer I keep coming up with is the fact that, it rests on the fact that we are social primates that spent so much of our evolution in rank ordered societies, right? We're rank ordered. And there are some in a social group that have more power and some that have less power. And we see that today, even among relatively egalitarian hunter gatherers, you see that. Well, where you lie on the hierarchy has fitness implications. Typically speaking, the higher you lie on a hierarchy, the more access to resources that you have that impact your fitness, your ability to produce offspring and send them into the next generation. So access to mates, access to food, access to territory, and in the modern day, to all the proxies for that, the big house, the fancy car, the political influence, right?
Mhm.
Well, I think where we lie on the spectrum politically has a role in helping us navigate that hierarchy. I think generally speaking, those who are lower on the hierarchy, those who are at a disadvantage, it benefits them to have a liberal orientation because liberal politics around the globe often seek to right power imbalances, right? They're more leaning towards equality. And not incidentally, women tend to be more egalitarian in their political orientations and their social orientations, right? Because women tend to be, they tend to have less power across the globe. Ethnic minorities, religious minorities too. So, among those groups, you tend to see more liberal politics and you tend to see more liberal policy preferences that in fact would seek to right power imbalances. You know, affirmative action, equal pay, things like that. Um, so that's one of the ways you see that. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're more conservative, typically you have more power and you want to maintain that power. It's a strategy for maintaining your position on the hierarchy. So
Yeah, and obviously we can talk about how that manifests itself today. You see it when that's the beauty of what your book is about, and looking at these issues through the evolutionary lens and figuring out the motivation at the very core, right? And once you know that, to me things become pretty straightforward.
yeah, that's what I love about this science. So much of human behavior is confusing and confounding, and politics is one of those. I mean, I always say, who among us doesn't watch the news and just like, oh my gosh, how could the other tribe think like this, right? Um, it's confusing, and that's because a lot of our evolved psychology is operates under the level of our conscious awareness. You know, instinct blindness is what that's been called. We're blind to our instincts, and the older they are, typically, we're more blind to our instincts. And I think it's crucially important to understand those instincts because, like I've said over and over and over, if you don't understand them, those who understand your instincts better than you, they're going to use them to manipulate you. And we see this during every presidential election, every congressional election. We see our evolutionary hot buttons being purposefully prodded by political interests that have the money to do the research into they have these staffers looking into all this evo psych research, and they know how to poke those hot buttons.
So when you say that, that makes me think of Trump pushing the fear, all the really basic evolutionary fear of the outsider. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh my gosh, that is such an old tactic, right? Fear mongering. So around every election there becomes this hype about the border, right? And yeah, I mean, we have to guard our borders. I get it. I'm from the border, I get it. And I, you know, I don't know that who really is supportive of truly open borders. I think that is,
I don't think anybody is really.
I can't imagine that. I get it. But that hype goes way, way up during an election cycle. I remember seeing this Fox News clip saying that right around the 2018 congressional elections, and you can see that this past election too. You can see that this tactic where they were saying that there's a caravan marching towards the border, and they're bringing all these deadly diseases like smallpox, for example, which has been eradicated since 1980, right? It's just a way to get the voting populace that is more fearful to get their attention to vote in the direction that they want them to vote, right? We see this today. So Trump's a master at that. He's a master of poking those fears. He uses phrases like, foreigners are going to come in and infest our country, you know.
Or
So
taint our
yeah,
blood, you know?
yeah. I mean, I'm telling you, these run on these very primitive evolutionary subroutines that that make people afraid. And when there's no threat, politicians will manufacture threat. And then they'll say, "Well, I will be the one to save you from that threat." So there we go. That's one of the ways that our evolutionary fears get prodded.
For our listeners, I've read your book a couple of times, so I'm very familiar with the underlying. Tell our listeners this base fear of outside pathogens, outside people, how that relates to our evolutionary past and our deep-seated fear of that kind of thing that gets activated by a politician like Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, like we talked about earlier, there was the threat of outside tribes in terms of just violence, right?
Right.
Intertribal warfare. One tribe raiding the other tribe and slaughtering its members. But that's not the only threat from the outside tribe. The outside tribe was often, a carrier of disease. And it's for most of our evolutionary history, there were no such thing as vaccines.
No.
There were no such thing as antibiotics. We were blind to this microbiological world around us. We didn't know what hand washing did. Nobody knew about that. And so the threat of pathogens was, in fact, a very real threat that shaped our psychology. Um, Something as simple as the common cold could wipe out an entire tribe. So, in tandem with this fear of outsiders is a fear of germs and disgust sensitivity, right? And so in our past, it made sense to fear people who may bring in an invisible pathogen that wiped out your whole family. There was no such thing as vaccines. But reliably, so to get your question, reliably, people who are more politically conservative tend to show greater fear of germs. Um, Now, the irony is like what happened during the 2016, what happened during COVID, rather, in 2020, 2021, where you saw the right really leaning into, these, COVID is a hoax conspiracy and anti-vax sentiment by a certain segment of the right? There are plenty of people on the right who got vaccinated and who understand what's
Like
happening.
like like Trump did and every Republican politician did.
Absolutely, right. Or many of them anyway. Um, but I think that really ties into our tribal psychology in a way that I think we should all understand. Um, and you can't answer that question without deeply considering what it means to be human. And the story I often tell is, look, we're we're pretty exceptional, but in a way we're not. Like think of the fastest man on the planet. Who is that? Who's that guy? Usain Bolt,
Usain
right?
Bolt used to be, yeah.
Or maybe still, I don't know. He could run. He's fast, right?
Or the
9.59, I think.
latest, yeah, the latest Olympic gold medalist for sure.
Like those guys are fast, right? They're not that fast. The average house cat would smoke them in a foot race, right? We're not
Right.
strong, right? A chimpanzee would rip off our
Hmm.
limbs in a cage, right? We're pretty weak. We're pretty vulnerable. We don't have these stabbing appendages or protective bony armor like some animals do. We're these weird, weak, soft-shelled primates, but we have each other and we have the unparalleled ability to understand each other's minds and to coordinate action. So in numbers we can overtake lions. In numbers we can overtake smaller tribes. Going along with the tribe benefited us throughout our evolutionary history. Conversely, going against our tribe was a deadly threat because if we were abandoned by the tribe, we didn't stand a chance, right?
Yeah.
And very often in our evolutionary past, our tribes would execute us if we weren't towing the cultural line.
Yep.
right? How many people got executed for being witches or for just thinking differently than how the tribe was
Or
thinking?
yeah, a woman demanding rights. Now you're a witch. We don't want you around
Now you're a
anymore.
witch.
Hmm.
And it can get to the point where it's just a competitor among your tribe that accuses you of something, right? That woman looked at my husband, she must be a witch, hang her.
Hmm.
How arbitrary did that become? And because of its arbitrariness, we developed an exquisite sensitivity to what our tribe mates think about us. And we often show signals of commitment to our tribe. And honestly, I think that is one of the biggest blinders that we have. Very often, when we're wrong about something, when our thinking is wrong about something, it's because we're going along with the tribe. We don't want to be seen as thinking wrong. We don't want to be seen as a heretic. We don't want to be seen as immoral. And so our thinking gets twisted a lot in order to show commitment to our tribe. And that's what I think happened in the case of COVID-19, where the right seemed to glom onto this attitude that the science of this is wrong. I think academia is mostly run by liberal interests, so let's not trust the vaccine. And that's how these things get perpetuated too. And they're dangerous. That's obviously dangerous. We lost over 1 million people during COVID. So that is, I think, an exception that can explain the exception of the right being, anti-vax, as we saw during the height of the pandemic.
Yeah, I
So,
think you bring up a good point, and you explain the oddity of, obviously, if you're on the right, you're a conservative, you want to keep germs away. That's a natural tendency, but you don't want to take the vaccine, right? So that's a weird thing. But it explains like part of the group. If you're thinking as group instead of individually, you're signaling to the group that you're in the group, and that totally explains it. As weird as
yeah,
that is.
and think about how much those protests identify an outside force. It was the scientists, it was the government, it was the CDC. These forces are against us, right? It's identifying an outside force. It's totally about showing commitment to your tribe and delineating yourself from an outsider. It all has that flavor to it. That's why I think we need to understand this psychology. Not only to avoid the political division that we've seen across the past two presidential elections. But what happens when there's an outbreak of a deadly disease like we've seen? Our politics, our need to belong to the tribe and show commitment to the tribe, does that make us more vulnerable? It obviously does.
Well, and there's a historical precedent. Like, over this happens all the time throughout history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What about evolutionary mismatches? It kind of plays into
Well,
this.
the evolutionary mismatch is the idea that we have traits for adapted for a certain environment, and they're mismatched for the current environment. They're a fitness disadvantage in the current environment. Um, I think a very liberal interpretation of that might be that you know it leads to unhealthy psychological behaviors or behaviors that put a lot of stress on us, even though that may not influence how much we reproduce, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, we come equipped with a blueprint for an environment in our past, and we've changed our environment so quickly with technology that we haven't had time to keep up, right? It's just been so sudden. I mean, for a frame of reference, my grandparents emigrated to the US in covered wagon. I kid you not. And in their lifetime, they saw the computer age start anyway, and us put men on the moon. I mean, that's a stunning uh, pace. So yeah, so the idea is that mismatches. Look, we have traits for a certain environment that may not be serving us in the current environment in which we find ourselves. And maybe some of these traits that we have to protect against germs, to protect against outsiders, um, maybe they're hurting our forward progress. That's a question I ask. I could be wrong, but maybe it is hurting us.
As you said before, it doesn't serve us anymore, or it may not serve us anymore.
It may not serve us anymore, but I can think of circumstances where it could serve us. I mean, I see what's happening in Europe too, where like in certain Scandinavian countries who are the most egalitarian, healthy societies in the world by I think pretty objective standards. Phil
Well,
Zuckerman,
Zuckerman, yeah.
yeah, did some fantastic research looking at societal health, right, on all these different indices: teenage pregnancy, GDP, access to healthcare, education level, and found that the healthiest societies tend to be like in Scandinavian countries and countries like Denmark and Holland, and they also happen to be the least religious. But you saw some of these countries open their doors to Muslim majority countries, let in a bunch of immigrants who are really vying for Sharia law in these highly egalitarian countries. And one of the problems is that those cultures, I think women in those cultures tend to have way less opportunities other than, just having children, right? So their birth rates are a lot higher. Let's put it that way. So you have a growing population that is steeped in these traditions that really, I think some of them are pretty dangerous, I think. I mean,
Of course.
Sharia law, for example.
Well, like the latest thing was in Afghanistan, they just voted to get rid of windows in kitchens.
So that women can't be seen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
So are there certain instances where openness to outside groups can be a liability? Certainly. Yeah. And I know I think we might get criticism for that. We might, some people might say, well, that's Islamophobia. It's really not. I mean,
no, I don't see. Yeah, I don't think so.
you know,
It's just being practical at that point, because what happens is the openness gets used against you. The mock, just like in the U.S., it's like you could say that. I heard someone say that white Christian nationalists are using democracy against us, everyone who's not a white Christian nationalist, to try to make this country more like what a white Christian nationalist would have.
yeah. Yeah. So I think it's important not to think in black and white terms. I don't think we can be open to every single culture. I think but I think having a filter, and having that filter be directed as much as we possibly can by rational thinking and not by these primitive survival based emotions that served a purpose, and they
Yes, for
they
sure.
they serve a purpose today still, but I think they have to be moderated by rational thinking.
Give the example of snakes and other things that people have irrational responses to
Oh
that
gosh,
carry
this is
over from
something
our
that I've seen in
past.
my own practice because, as you know, I'm a clinical psychologist, and so, when we look at specific phobias, for example, phobias of threats that were present in our evolutionary past are far, far, far disproportionate to real killers in the modern day. And actually, the things that kill people most in the modern day have to do with this idea of evolutionary mismatch. They're mismatched diseases, right? So in our past, it benefited us to binge on high fat, high sugar foods whenever they were available, which was hardly ever. And today we have this craving for those foods, yet we have access to them like at no other time. And so, we have, especially in the US, especially in Texas where I live, like, rampant type 2 diabetes and heart disease, which kills more people than any other cause of death, right? Venomous snakes, however, hardly kill anybody in this country, but they're way overrepresented in our phobic fears. So people tend to fear snakes in places where your chances of encountering them are practically nothing, like in Minnesota, for example, or New York City, or somewhere where you just there's hardly any, you know. So that's an idea of a mismatch.
Um, what about the environment a mismatch as far as, I mean, you already touched this, but the fear of the other, um, how, how, how is that serving us now?
How is it serving us now, the fear of the other? That's a big
Or
question.
not serving us, I should say.
That's an open question, right? Um, the problem that I see is that, our modern day political apparatus um, tends to create this notion of the other in order to get votes, in order to get policy support within our nation's borders. And they target our evolutionary impulses. It's so once you understand the formula, it's so easy to see in media, right? And social media, in the news. So that's the way I think fear of the other doesn't serve us, is that it makes us hate our own countrymen. It makes us hate our own family members, our neighbors, you know. And I just I just kind of shudder when I think of how our nation seems to be heading in that direction. We're very politically divided at this point.
Um, I've always said that the Democrats have an uphill battle because they're promoting hope and the Republicans are promoting fear to some degree. And hope's just not a really easy button
Fear
to
sells,
push.
man. Fear sells. And even that too is based on our evolutionary psychology, right? I mean, um, it's better to have a false negative than a false positive, right? So, if you think that there's a lion in the bushes when it's really the wind, there's no harm done. You just get a spike of adrenaline, you keep moving. But if you think, hey, that's probably the wind and it's the lion, then you're in trouble, right? And our neurology, our psychology is kind of based on that logic. And so yeah, fear sells, fear motivates more than hope in a lot of instances, unfortunately.
From a big picture, tell our listeners in this in the spectrum of humans, Homo sapien, we're just the last 200 years, the last even 1,000 years is such a small part of our evolution. And we've got all these things that have happened to us as humans, in the culture. Give us a big picture of like how little time we've spent in this space that we're in now.
Oh my gosh. Well, you said it just there. I mean, past couple hundred years. I mean, you know, um, in my great grandparents' day, there was hunter-gatherers running around the U.S. I mean, with the threat of the Apache tribes is a real concern to my great grandparents, right? Um, and today, we're on the precipice of like some enormous change with artificial intelligence, and our technology is just it's just exponentiating. So yeah, the saying is that we're in the modern day with housing Stone Age brains, and we really are. So we'll see how we deal with it. I think that's why I think it's so important to understand our evolutionary impulses, our instincts. And usually the older they are, the more tied to survival they are, the more leavened they are with intense emotions. And those are the ones we need to pay attention to. So I try to ask people, pay attention to when you feel outrage. Pay attention when you read something on social media and you get angry, or you feel outraged, or you feel defensive. Pay attention to that, because those are your instincts talking. And ask yourself, is this being intentionally manipulated? Is the threat real, or is it as black and white as you're seeing it in this moment? That's right. That's what I ask people to do.
How do you
It's an
think?
uphill battle, right?
Oh
But
yeah.
I think it's a good mission.
How do you see tribalism from our past affecting our politics today?
Oh my gosh. In all the ways we've been talking about, right? I mean, one group will present in the media an extreme version of the other group. The other group responds, with an extreme version of the group that's mischaracterizing them, and it just goes back and forth. And then what happens is we get into these tighter and tighter these tighter and tighter and tighter shows of loyalty to our tribe. These
Well, the
uh,
signaling.
yeah, the signaling purity, right, to a cultural ideal that becomes more extreme. Um, and both sides do it. The left does it, the right does it to each other, and in the end, we can't have conversations with one another. And I think that's a mistake.
I look at my family gatherings and think about what changed.
Yeah,
And to me, what changed was that you had George W. Bush, your normal Republican, um, what's his name from Utah, Mitt Romney. You
yeah.
know, they weren't separating children from their parents at the border. And so you get Trump, and now he's overtly racist. He's overtly xenophobic. He's has no problem separating children from their families as a deterrent. And to me, that's where things change. And it's like now your family that used to vote for your regular Republican who, I never had a problem with George W. Bush from a character standpoint or Mitt Romney that much. I didn't like their policies, but it was nothing to get mad at my relatives that voted for those folks. But then you have Trump, and to me, that's where things change. Where now I don't necessarily want to hang out with someone who voted for Trump because of all the policies and all the bad things and the bad characters. Like, how could you vote for this person? So that's where I see things have changed. I don't know if you see any of that or agree with any of that.
Oh, I think Trump definitely changed the calculus. I think too, the internet allows these divisive ideas to sear its way across the population very effectively, very fast, very effectively.
Social
And
media. Mm.
there's good evidence to suggest that outside nations try to manipulate the direction of elections by just flooding social media with divisive memes that really tap into these evolved inclinations that we've been talking about, and that's another factor. But yeah, Trump is definitely a factor. He knows his base, and I think one of the most effective ways to motivate people is through outrage and fear, and it's nothing new. He's just
Yeah.
he's just very concrete about how he does it. He just doesn't hold back. He's overt.
He also has the advantage of social media that didn't exist for other authoritarians.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Let's do talk about propensity for people to be authoritarian.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of this ties into that pressure of outside tribes that we've been talking about. I mean, this is a hypothesis that I think has a lot of support. One thing that I have focused on is an instrument that we use to measure right-wing authoritarianism, and this was a scale called the RWA scale that was developed in the wake of World War II, when social scientists were trying to make sense of what happened um, overseas with the Nazi Party and Hitler's Germany, and how people could be so swung by authoritarians and do things that ostensibly they wouldn't do under normal circumstances. And one of the things they came up with was this scale that has three factors. One factor is deference to authorities, to authority figures. And usually authority figures across the globe, even in the modern day, have been men. And usually they've been big, strong, loud, protective men, right? When we look at voting preferences across the past couple hundred years, people tend to vote for the taller of the two candidates, like almost always.
Always, yeah.
Which really ties back to this idea that, look, somewhere in our past, big leaders physically supported us in conflicts, right? If you're a chimpanzee, you want to ally yourself with the biggest, toughest male. That's the one you want as a friend because he's going to get your back in a fight.
Well, and the
So
alpha male ape is the first one that goes to defend the group.
you want somebody strong, right? Physically strong, and this is another example of a mismatch, right? I mean, what modern president is ever going to physically represent us in a fight? They're not going to go to war ever. Um, so, deference to authority figures, uh, tendency to conform to what other people are doing, like really a strong need to conform. I'm going to do what the person next to me does. I'm going to think what the person next to me thinks. All right. That ties into what we were talking about before, safety in numbers, right? Um, and fear of being ejected by your tribe and aggression towards outsiders. That's another factor in that scale. Well, all of those factors serve us really well in a combat theater, in a dangerous situation, right? You want to defer to authority figures. If on the battlefield, if you're making decisions by consensus, you can't respond in time. You can get slaughtered. You have to do what the other person is doing to coordinate action, right? And the very purpose of armies is to aggress against outsiders. So I think authoritarianism more broadly taps into that psychology. Now, it's not limited to the right. In fact, there's been a growing body of research looking at so-called woke culture. And I know that means different things to different people. For certain people on the left, that means being aware of power differences, being awake to that, being aware of those differences and
Yeah.
how they're embedded in our politics.
Yeah, historical, yeah.
But I think um, on the right, or even some people on the left and moderates see that as being excessively conforming to left-wing ideals. And so the more we study that culture, it seems to align a lot with right-wing authoritarianism in terms of thinking in all or none terms, right?
Yep. Very.
Fearing people who don't think like you, responding emotionally to outside threat. Um, a notable difference to authority figures. And I think that probably taps into what we were talking about before, that, liberal politics generally is about righting power imbalances. And if that benefits your fitness, you're going to reject those with more power, the authority figures, and seek to ally yourself with people who may, maybe you build up enough momentum to overthrow those who are in power, and do so by conforming to this, the same thought, right?
Yeah. Ideological purity.
Ideological purity, we have to be extremely wary of that, because I think that is when our thinking goes awry and we think irrational thoughts.
Well, tell our listeners that political views are not just a straight line; it's a horseshoe, and that explains the far left, far right having some of the same attributes.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're all tribalists, we're all tribalists. That's how we evolved. We evolved in tribes. We evolved with outside threats. So the left is not immune to tribalistic thinking, you know. But I think there are some general differences in how that tribalism tends to express itself, right? I think tribalism among the left seeks to right power imbalances. Tribalism on the right seems to, seek to maintain those differences. So it's kind of complicated, but when you understand those evolutionary forces, it certainly to me seems a lot clearer than, the surface level descriptions of our political psychology that we normally hear about. That's the beauty of evolutionary science, for example. When you think about just the ultimate reasons for a political opinion or any kind of irrational behavior, for example, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense, right? It makes perfect sense when you think about it. So I think we have to be careful not to be reductionistic in our thinking. There's also culture, but sometimes our culture reflects these kind of deeper tendencies.
Well, speaking of culture, one last area I wanted to get into before I let you go is as more conservative the culture, conservative religion, or conservative the society, the less rights there are for women. I'm going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the argument that I make is that in those societies, male reproductive imperatives tend to be exaggerated. One of the biggest threats to males across species, not in every species, but across species, is the threat of cuckoldry. So that term comes from the cuckoo bird. Is the species of bird that engages in something called brood parasitism, lays its eggs in another species' nests, and takes off, right? Those birds have to raise chicks that are no genetic relation, and that's evolutionarily that's dangerous, right? You can spend an entire breeding season
dead end, yeah.
Taking risks, spending energy for little imposters in your nest, right? That's a threat. So men evolved sensitivity to that threat because for men who invest quite a bit in their offspring, more than any other species, that's a huge threat, because if you spend a decade or two investing in your neighbor's kids, then your genes are done for, right? You're not expressing them into the next generation. And by the way, I think it's important to recognize that men really have contributed to child rearing throughout our history. Otherwise, we just wouldn't have survived. Human offspring takes so much provisioning, and so that because of that, men are especially sensitive to cuckoldry, to risk, whereas women never have to worry about that. A woman always knows if a child is hers, right? So in a lot of these, and our politics can reflect those concerns, right? So up until like 72 or 3, I think it was legal in Texas to murder your wife if you caught her cheating on you. So, we can legislate these really old evolutionary imperatives. And it's not all men, too. It's not only men. So women, for instance, have an evolutionary incentive to ensure that their sons don't get cuckolded, right? Because sons carry their mother's genes, and sons have a greater capacity to spread those genes for their moms than do daughters, right? A son can have 20, 30, 50 kids. A daughter can't. So in cultures where women can get away with it, they can get really brutal towards their daughters-in-law, and engage in all kinds of things to ensure that she remains, physically, like assaulting their daughters-in-law. And so we definitely see that. Well, so to answer your question about how this plays out politically, so the most conservative nations in the world also tend to be Muslim majority. And you see cuckoldry concerns expressed most vehemently in those cultures, right? So, some cultures, women have to have a male chaperone to travel outside the home. That is very obviously to make guard, right? To ensure that nothing happens to possibly create a cuckoldry situation for the man or for the family. Draping women in burqas, for example, so that signs of fertility aren't available to outside men. That's another example. So yeah, all of our evolutionary drives, a lot of them tend to get expressed in our politics. They tend to get expressed in our religions, which are, if nothing else, they're political systems. And so yeah, that's one example of how that can happen.
What do you hope for people to get out of reading your book?
Oh my gosh, just think more rationally about your political opinions. Try to understand people from the other side. One of the best compliments I got after a talk when I was on book tour, somebody came up and said, "You know what? I used to really hate my family, the Trump supporters in my family, but now I have more compassion for them." That's pretty cool. I did not expect that. But if that outcome can happen, that sounds great. I mean, I think the more we understand our impulses, the more we can make conscious, rational choices. And maybe if you understand them, maybe you make the same choice. Maybe maybe you make a different choice. But at least they should be conscious decisions, I think.
In your research, did anything jump out at you, surprise you?
Oh gosh, one thing that I found really interesting was that I write about how liberal policies, because they focus on provisioning, because they focus on things like paid maternity leave and paid childcare, they tend to support women, female-centric reproductive strategies, right? That the more daughters men have, the more liberal their policy preferences. We see this even among congressmen, irrespective of political ideology. So if you're a Republican congressman, the more daughters you have, that's going to influence how you vote. You're going to vote for more liberal policies. So, there's so much of our psychological machinery that drives survival and reproduction gets expressed in our policy preferences in the voting booth and who we choose to talk to at the Thanksgiving Day dinner table. Again, let's just be aware of it. Let's just be aware of it and make conscious choices.
Well, Hector, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your expertise and knowledge. I definitely want to have you back, talk about your other book, Alpha God. So I look forward to doing that.
Love to. Always a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Thanks again to Hector for joining me this week and sharing his knowledge and expertise. I hope you enjoyed learning about sex, power, and partisanship through the lens of evolutionary psychology. Thanks for watching and listening. I hope everyone has a great week.